The Grand Galactic Council had seen its share of diplomatic disasters over the millennia, but none quite like the one brewing in Conference Hall Alpha 9 on this particular Tuesday morning. Well, Tuesday by human standards anyway. The Slenorians called it third pulse after the greater dimming, which honestly sounded like someone having a stroke. But hey, when in Rome, or in this case, when orbiting the gas giant Kepler in a space station the size of Manhattan, you roll with the local customs. Ambassador Juno sat in the human delegation's assigned seat, a modest little spot wedged between the Altarians and what appeared to be a species that looked like walking houseplants with anger management issues. She'd been Earth's diplomatic representative for exactly 6 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days, which in galactic politics terms made her practically an embryo. Fresh meat, a diplomatic appetizer waiting to be devoured by beings who'd been playing politics since her species was still figuring out fire. The council chamber itself was a marvel of engineering and ego, a massive spherical room where delegates sat on platforms that could move and rotate at will, creating what the architects probably called dynamic discourse positioning, but what Juno had quickly learned to recognize as musical chairs for species with superiority complexes. The lighting shifted constantly to accommodate the visual preferences of different species, which meant Juno spent most sessions feeling like she was inside a disco ball having an existential crisis. Chancellor Vexani, a tall, elegant Slenorian with skin that shifted between silver and blue depending on her mood, currently a rather ominous shade of slate, called the session to order with a sound that could only be described as a tuning fork having an argument with a wind chime. "Today's agenda," she announced, her voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested she'd never been told no in her considerably long life, "concerns the implementation of restricted species integration protocols, specifically the matter of primitive observers." Ah yes, Juno thought, the primitive observer debate. Because nothing said advanced galactic civilization like arguing over who gets to sit in the cheap seats and watch the grown-ups talk. The topic at hand was the Kithra, a species that had been discovered roughly 50 standard cycles ago on a small planet in the Andromeda Reach. They were small, furry, and had the unfortunate habit of communicating through a combination of chittering sounds and what the Council's xenoanthropologists had classified as rudimentary holographic displays. In other words, they were adorable, they made cute noises, and they created pretty light shows. The Council had collectively decided this made them about as intellectually threatening as a particularly artistic hamster. 3 Kithra cubs, because that's what the Council insisted on calling them, despite the fact that they were clearly adults of their species, sat in the observation deck. Or rather, they had been sitting there until Security Chief Gornex decided they were somehow disrupting the proceedings. Gornex was a brutarian, which meant he was roughly the size and temperament of a small mountain that had decided to take up law enforcement. His species had evolved from pack hunters on a high-gravity world, which explained why he moved like he was constantly fighting the urge to tackle something, and why his idea of crowd control typically involved a lot of pointing and growling. "The observers must be removed," Gornex rumbled, his voice carrying the subtle charm of grinding tectonic plates. "They are disruptive." Juno glanced up at the observation deck. The 3 Kithra cubs were sitting quietly, occasionally chittering to each other in what sounded like musical whispers. One of them, the smallest, with markings that reminded Juno of a silver fox, was creating tiny holographic patterns in the air with his paws. Pretty, abstract shapes that shifted and flowed like liquid light. Disruptive? They were probably the most well-behaved observers she'd ever seen in a council session. Disruptive how, exactly? The words were out of Juno's mouth before her diplomatic training could tackle them and stuff them back where they belonged. The chamber fell silent. Not the comfortable kind of silence that happens when everyone pauses to consider a thoughtful question, but the kind of silence that happens when someone accidentally sets off a fire alarm during a funeral. Every eye, sensor, and photoreceptor in the room turned toward the human delegation's tiny platform. Chancellor Vexani's skin shifted to a deeper blue. Definitely not a good sign. The human delegate will refrain from interrupting council proceedings. "I wasn't interrupting," Juno said, and she could practically hear Director Holt back on Earth having a stress-induced cardiac event. "I was asking for clarification. The Kithra observers appear to be following all established protocols for—" "The primitive species," Councillor Thrask interrupted, his reptilian features twisting into what might have been a smile if you ignored the rows of predatory teeth, "are not capable of understanding the complex nature of our discussions. Their presence serves no constructive purpose." Juno felt something hot and familiar rising in her chest. The same feeling she'd gotten as a kid when she'd seen bigger kids picking on smaller ones. The same righteous indignation that had gotten her into trouble more times than she could count. Her diplomatic training screamed at her to sit down, shut up, and let the adults handle things. She stood up instead. "With respect, Councillor Thrask," she said, and anyone who knew Juno well would have recognized the particular tone she used when she was about to say something that would definitely not be respectful. "How exactly have we determined that the Kithra are incapable of understanding our discussions? Has anyone actually tried to include them? Or are we just assuming that because they communicate differently, they must be intellectually inferior?" The silence got more pregnant. Twins, maybe triplets. Security Chief Gornex took a step toward the observation deck, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed to have their own gravitational pull. "The observers will be escorted out. Now." But something interesting happened as Gornex approached the Kithra cubs. Instead of cowering or fleeing, they looked down at Juno. The smallest one, the one with the silver markings, tilted his head and made a soft chittering sound that somehow conveyed both curiosity and gratitude. "Wait," Juno called out. And now she was definitely off script, probably off the diplomatic reservation entirely, and quite possibly about to become the shortest-serving human ambassador in history. "If we're going to discuss integration protocols for restricted species, shouldn't we at least consider the input of the species in question?" Chancellor Vexani's skin was now approaching the color of deep space, which Juno was pretty sure meant she was either furious or about to undergo some kind of biological process that humans really didn't want to witness. "The human delegate will cease this disruption immediately," the Chancellor said, her voice carrying harmonics that made Juno's teeth itch, or face removal from the proceedings. "I'm not being disruptive," Juno protested, though she was absolutely being disruptive, and everyone knew it. "I'm advocating for due process. If we're making decisions about the Kithara, shouldn't they have some say in the matter?" Gornex had reached the observation deck and was making shooing motions at the cubs with hands the size of dinner plates. But the cubs weren't moving. They were looking at Juno with what could only be described as intense interest, their large eyes reflecting the chamber's shifting lights like tiny galaxies. The smallest cub, Juno found herself thinking of him as Nyx, though she had no idea why, suddenly stood up and began creating a more complex holographic display. The lights that had been simple, abstract patterns suddenly coalesced into something that made Juno's breath catch. It was a perfect three-dimensional representation of the council chamber, complete with tiny figures representing each delegate. And it was accurate down to the smallest detail. The positioning of the platforms, the architectural features, even the way Chancellor Vexani's skin was shifting colors in real time. "Fascinating primitive art," Counselor Thrask said dismissively, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Juno stared at the holographic display. That wasn't primitive art. That was advanced real-time environmental mapping with predictive modeling capabilities. The little cub wasn't just creating pretty pictures. He was demonstrating a level of technological sophistication that most council species would struggle to match. "Security Chief Gornex," Chancellor Vexani commanded, "remove the observers immediately." But as Gornex reached for the cubs, something unexpected happened. They moved. Not in panic or fear, but with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of advanced tactical training. One moment, they were sitting in their assigned spots. The next, they were flowing around Gornex, like water around a boulder, their movements so fluid and synchronized that it looked almost choreographed. And then, they did something that made the entire council chamber gasp, growl, or emit whatever sound their species made when surprised. They jumped. From the observation deck to the main floor, a drop that should have been impossible for creatures their size. But they landed with perfect grace, their small forms absorbing the impact like they'd been designed for it. And then, without hesitation, they scampered toward the human delegation platform. "The observers are attempting to breach security protocols," Gornex announced, lumbering after them with all the speed and subtlety of a small avalanche. But the cubs had already reached Juno's platform, and they sat there looking up at her with expressions that somehow managed to convey both mischief and intelligence. Nyx chittered something that sounded almost like laughter and created a small holographic display that showed a perfectly rendered image of Gornex trying to fit through a doorway that was clearly too small for him. Juno couldn't help it. She laughed. It was a short laugh, quickly stifled, but in the acoustics of the council chamber, it might as well have been a full-throated guffaw. The chamber erupted in outraged exclamations from at least 6 different species, and Chancellor Vexani's skin reached a shade of blue that probably had its own name in the Slenorian color spectrum. "The human delegate has encouraged this disruption," she declared. "Security, escort Ambassador Juno from the chamber." "Now wait, Juno began, but Gornex was already approaching, flanked by 2 other security officers who looked like they'd been recruited from the same imposing alien bouncer catalog. "Ambassador Juno," Gornex rumbled, "you will come with us." "Now." Juno looked down at the 3 cubs, who were watching the proceedings with bright, alert eyes. There was something in their gaze. Intelligence, yes, but also something else. Hope, maybe. Or recognition. As if they'd been waiting for someone, anyone, to stand up for them. She sighed, knowing that her career as Earth's diplomatic representative was probably about to end before it had really begun. Director Holt was going to have her head. The review board was going to ask questions she didn't have good answers for. Her mother was going to give her that look, the one that said, "I told you, your mouth would get you in trouble someday." But as she stood to leave, she caught sight of Nyx creating one more holographic display. This one was simple. Just 2 figures, one human-shaped and 3 smaller ones, walking together. And somehow, in the interplay of light and shadow, it conveyed a message that transcended species barriers. "Thank you." "Come on, then," Juno said to the cubs, surprising herself. "I guess we're all leaving together." As security escorted them from the chamber, Juno couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made either the best decision of her diplomatic career or the worst. Possibly both. The corridor outside Conference Hall Alpha 9 was what architects probably called functionally elegant, and what Juno called aggressively beige. The walls curved in that universal space station way that was supposed to make you feel like you were inside something organic and welcoming, but mostly just reminded her that she was floating in a metal can surrounded by the vacuum of space. Not exactly comforting when your diplomatic career was also experiencing a rapid decompression. Security Chief Gornex walked behind them with the measured pace of someone who was absolutely certain that his charges weren't going anywhere fast. His two backup officers flanked the group. One looked like he'd been carved from volcanic rock and had roughly the same personality, while the other appeared to be some kind of crystalline being who made tiny tinkling sounds with each step, like a wind chime with a grudge. The three Kithra cubs trotted alongside Juno, their small legs working overtime to keep pace with the longer strides of the bipedal species. They chattered to each other in their musical language, occasionally glancing up at Juno with those impossibly large eyes that seemed to take in everything. "So," Juno said, because awkward silence had never been her strong suit, "I don't suppose anyone asked where exactly we're being escorted to?" Gornex's response was a grunt that could have meant anything from processing center to airlock to none of your business human. Given his track record with customer service, Juno wasn't feeling particularly optimistic about any of those options. Nix, she was definitely thinking of the smallest cub as Nix now, whether that was his actual name or not, suddenly stopped walking. His companions, Fuzz and Bounce, immediately flanked him in a formation that looked less like cute animals following their friend, and more like tactical unit assuming defensive positions. Gornex noticed the halt and turned around, his massive frame looming over the small group. "Move along." No delays. But Nix was creating another holographic display, this one more complex than anything Juno had seen in the council chamber. The lights swirled and coalesced into what appeared to be a schematic of the space station, not just the public areas that any tourist could access, but service corridors, maintenance shafts, and what looked suspiciously like security checkpoints. "Primitive art," Gornex said dismissively, but there was less certainty in his voice than before. Juno stared at the display. "That's not art," she said slowly. "That's a blueprint." The hologram zoomed in on their current location, showing their exact position in the corridor. Then it traced several different paths, some leading to what appeared to be detention facilities, others to transport bays, and one that seemed to wind through a series of maintenance tunnels toward somewhere that was blinking with a soft blue light. "How do you know the layout of this station?" Juno asked the cubs. Fuzz chittered something that sounded almost like laughter and began creating her own display. This one showed the station from the outside, but with layers that revealed internal structures, power conduits, and what looked like data pathways. It was the kind of comprehensive analysis that would take most species intelligence services months to compile. "We need to keep moving," Gornex growled, but now he was looking at the holographic displays with something that might have been concern. Bounce, the most energetic of the cubs, suddenly bounded forward and began creating rapid-fire images in the air. Snapshots that flicked past so quickly they were almost subliminal. But Juno caught glimpses. Security cameras being monitored, communication arrays being analyzed, council members in private meetings. "Oh my God," Juno breathed. "You've been spying on everyone." Nix tilted his head and made a sound that somehow conveyed both confirmation and gentle correction. Then he created a new display, this one showing various species engaged in different activities throughout the station. But these weren't spy images. They were behavioral studies, analysis. The cubs hadn't been watching everyone like predators stalking prey. They'd been observing like scientists studying fascinating new subjects. "The observers will cease these displays immediately," Gornex commanded, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "You didn't get to be head of security without recognizing intelligence gathering when you saw it, and what the Cubs were showing was far more sophisticated than anything in his own department's files." The crystalline security officer made a series of wind chime sounds that Juno's universal translator rendered as, "Perhaps we should alert the—" but he was cut off by Gornex's booming silence. That's when things got interesting. Fuzz created a holographic display that showed Gornex himself, but not as he appeared now. This was Gornex in what looked like a private meeting with several other beings that Juno didn't recognize. The image showed documents being exchanged, data chips being passed, and what appeared to be some kind of payment being made. Gornex went very, very still. "Where did you get these images?" he asked, and his voice had dropped to the kind of low rumble that suggested immediate violence was being strongly considered. Nix chittered something that sounded almost apologetic, then created a display that showed the Cubs' observation post. It wasn't just the public gallery in the council chamber. They had somehow gained access to monitoring stations throughout the facility. Security cameras, communication relays, even what appeared to be private meeting rooms. And they had been recording everything. "The primitive observers," Gornex said slowly, "are not as primitive as we believed." "You think?" Juno said, because sarcasm was apparently her default response to having her worldview completely rearranged. What gave it away? The advanced holographic technology, the comprehensive intelligence gathering, or the fact that they just showed you evidence of whatever shady deal you've been involved in? The volcanic rock security officer reached for something that was probably a weapon, but Bounce was already in motion. The Cub didn't run. He flowed, moving with a speed and agility that made Juno's eyes water trying to track him. In the space of a heartbeat, he had somehow gotten behind the officer and was creating a holographic display that showed the exact location of every weapon, communication device, and piece of equipment the security team was carrying. "They're not just intelligent," Juno realized. "They're military." Nix made a sound that might have been agreement, then created a new display. This one showing what appeared to be a family tree or organizational chart. The Kithra weren't just one species. They were a collection of subspecialties: scientists, engineers, tacticians, and what looked suspiciously like spies and infiltration specialists. "The Council thinks you're cute pets," Juno said, understanding flooding through her. "But you're actually an advanced reconnaissance unit." Fuzz chittered something that sounded delighted and created a holographic image of a Kithra cub sitting in a council member's lap, being fed treats while simultaneously recording every word of a classified conversation. "Oh, this is beautiful," Juno laughed, despite the fact that they were currently being detained by increasingly nervous security officers. "You've been playing dumb while gathering intelligence on every major galactic power. How long have you been doing this?" The answer came in the form of a time-lapse hologram that showed the Cub's arrival at the station, followed by cycles of careful observation, data gathering, and analysis. Not just weeks or months. They'd been at this for standard cycles, building comprehensive profiles on every species, every political alliance, and every dirty little secret the Council thought was safely hidden. "The human will cease encouraging this disruption," Gornex said, but his heart clearly wasn't in it anymore. You could see the calculations running behind his eyes. If the Cubs had evidence of his private dealings, what else did they know? What other secrets had they uncovered? That's when Ambassador Keelin appeared around the corner. moving with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested they had been looking for this particular group. The Altarian was tall and elegant, with features that seemed to shift between masculine and feminine depending on the angle, and an expression that suggested they were both amused and deeply concerned. "Ambassador Juno," they said, their voice carrying the melodious tones that made Altarian diplomats so effective at mediation. "I believe we need to talk." "I'm kind of in the middle of being detained," Juno pointed out. "Yes, I noticed. Security Chief Gornex, I'll need to borrow your prisoners for a moment." Gornex's expression could have curdled milk at 50 paces. "The human and the observers are being processed for disruption of council proceedings." "I'm sure they are. However, I have some questions about the images the observers have been sharing, particularly the ones involving certain council members and what appear to be unauthorized financial transactions." The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as industrial-strength awkwardness. Keelin smiled, and it was the kind of smile that suggested they knew exactly how much trouble everyone was in. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more private. I believe the observers have some information that the council would find very interesting." Nix chittered something that sounded almost like purring, then created a holographic display that showed a secure conference room several levels down. The image zoomed in to show the room's privacy features, signal dampeners, recording blockers, and what appeared to be some very sophisticated security measures. "They're suggesting a location," Juno said unnecessarily. "Of course they are," Keelin replied. "The question is whether we trust them enough to follow their recommendation." Juno looked down at the three cubs, who were regarding her with expressions that somehow managed to convey both innocence and complete awareness of the chaos they were about to unleash. "Well," she said, "it's not like my diplomatic career can get any more derailed than it already is. Lead the way." As they headed toward the maintenance lifts that would take them to the secure level, Juno couldn't help but notice that Security Chief Gornex and his officers were following at a much more respectful distance than before. Nothing changed a power dynamic quite like discovering that the primitive observers you'd been pushing around were actually intelligence operatives who had been documenting your every questionable decision. The cubs trotted beside her, occasionally creating small holographic displays that seemed designed purely to amuse. Tiny figures of various council members tripping over their own feet, caricatures of pompous speeches, and what appeared to be a running commentary on the architectural choices of the space station's designers. "You know," Juno said to Nix, "I have a feeling this is going to be the beginning of a very interesting partnership." His response was a chittering sound that definitely qualified as laughter, followed by a holographic display that showed a human and 3 Kithra cubs standing on top of a pile of very surprised-looking council members. Juno decided she liked these cubs more and more. The secure conference room was exactly the kind of place where galactic conspiracies went to die. Located in the bowels of Nexus Prime, it was a windowless chamber lined with enough signal-dampening technology to make a paranoid AI weep with joy. The walls hummed with the subtle vibration of active privacy shields, and the lighting had that harsh, institutional quality that made everyone look like they were either planning a coup or recovering from one. Ambassador Keelin sealed the door behind them with the kind of deliberate care that suggested they were either very security-conscious or very aware that what they were about to discuss could get them all spaced without trial. Probably both. "Well," Keelin said, settling into one of the chairs that had been designed by someone who clearly believed comfort was a sign of weakness, "this should be interesting." Security Chief Gornex and his crystalline colleague had positioned themselves near the door in what they probably thought was a casual manner, but actually looked like they were preparing to either flee or start shooting. The volcanic rock officer had been dismissed. Apparently, even Gornex had limits to how many witnesses he wanted for whatever was about to unfold. The three Kithra cubs sat in the center of the room like they owned the place, which, given what Juno was beginning to understand about their capabilities, they might as well have. Nyx was creating a slow, swirling holographic display that looked like abstract art, but was probably a real-time scan of everyone's vital signs. Fuzz had her paws pressed against the table's surface, and tiny lights were flickering under her touch. She was either communing with the room's computer systems or giving it a very thorough massage. Bounce was perfectly still, but his large eyes were tracking every movement in the room with the kind of attention that suggested he was calculating optimal escape routes and attack vectors. "So," Juno said, because someone had to break the tension before it crystallized into something that could be used as a weapon. "I'm guessing this isn't about my disruptive behavior in council chambers anymore?" Keelin's laugh had the musical quality that made Altarians such effective diplomats, but underneath it was a note that suggested they were operating on about 6 different levels of stress. "Oh, it absolutely is about disruptive behavior, just not yours." Nyx chittered something that might have been agreement, and expanded his holographic display. The swirling patterns resolved into something that made Juno's stomach perform an impressive gymnastics routine. It was a network diagram, a vast, interconnected web that showed connections between various council members, external organizations, and what appeared to be resource extraction operations on dozens of worlds. At the center of it all was a pulsing node labeled with symbols that Juno's translator couldn't quite parse, but the overall structure was unmistakable. "That's a conspiracy map," Juno said unnecessarily. "More specifically," Keelin said, their voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that diplomats used when they were about to drop a bomb. "It's a map of the Restricted Species Exploitation Network." Gornex made a sound like a landslide having an argument with itself. "These are fabricated images, primitive forgeries." Fuzz looked up from whatever she was doing to the table and made a sound that could only be described as a snort. Then she created her own holographic display, this one showing Gornex himself in what appeared to be a private meeting with Counselor Thrask and 2 other beings Juno didn't recognize. The timestamp showed it was from just 3 standard days ago. In the recording, Thrask was saying something about accelerating the classification timeline and ensuring the human delegation doesn't interfere with Phase 3. "Phase 3 of what?" Juno asked, though she was getting a sinking feeling that she already knew. The answer came in the form of another holographic display, this one showing a star chart with various worlds highlighted in different colors. Red worlds appeared to be classified as primitive. Yellow ones were under evaluation, and green ones were labeled as resource extraction approved. Earth was yellow. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," Juno said. Keelin's expression had gone from diplomatically neutral to grimly sympathetic. "The restricted species integration protocols aren't about integration at all. They're about identifying worlds with valuable resources and populations that can be easily controlled or eliminated." Bounce suddenly sprang into action, creating a rapid sequence of holographic images that told a story Juno really wished was fiction. It showed various worlds being evaluated by council survey teams, classified as primitive, based on criteria that seemed suspiciously flexible, and then systematically stripped of resources while their populations were either relocated or simply written off as acceptable losses in the name of galactic development. "How many worlds?" Juno asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Nix's response was a number that appeared in holographic digits above his head. The translator rendered it as approximately 231 worlds over the past 50 standard cycles. 231 civilizations, Juno repeated, feeling like she'd been punched in the stomach by mathematics. And they're planning to do the same thing to Earth. The human homeworld possesses significant rare Earth deposits, Gornek said, apparently deciding that since his cover was blown, he might as well go full villain monologue. And your species shows concerning signs of rapid technological advancement. It's more efficient to classify you as primitive now, before you become a genuine threat to established order. Juno stared at him. You're talking about genocide with the casual tone most people use to discuss lunch options. I'm talking about resource management and threat mitigation, Gornex replied. Your species has already demonstrated dangerous unpredictability. Today's disruption merely confirms the assessment. My disruption, Juno said, her voice rising to a pitch that could probably be heard through the privacy shielding, was pointing out that you were treating the Kithra like pets instead of people. How exactly does that constitute a galactic threat? It demonstrates inappropriate emotional attachment to primitive species, Counselor Thrask's voice said from the room's communication system, a liability that cannot be tolerated in civilized discourse. Everyone turned to stare at the wall-mounted speaker. Keelin's expression suggested they were calculating the probability of someone having listening devices in a supposedly secure room and not liking the math. Counselor Thrask, Keelin said carefully, this is a private consultation. Privacy is a luxury afforded to species that understand their place in the galactic order, Thrask's voice replied. The human delegation has demonstrated that they do not. Fuzz made a disgusted, chittering sound and pressed both paws against the table. Suddenly, every screen and display in the room came alive with data streams, security footage, and what appeared to be intercepted communications. It was like watching the digital nervous system of the entire space station laid bare. And it was all being controlled by a creature that most of the council thought was barely more intelligent than a houseplant. The Kithra infiltration unit has been more thorough than anticipated, Thrask's voice continued, but now there was a note of strain that hadn't been there before. This presents complications. Infiltration unit? Keelin asked. Nix created a holographic display that showed the Kithra homeworld, not the small, primitive planet that appeared in official council records, but a technologically advanced civilization, with cities that stretched across continents and orbital installations that rivaled anything the Council had ever built. The Kithra aren't primitive, Juno realized. They're playing the longest con in galactic history. Bounce chittered something that sounded like agreement and created an image showing Kithra operatives on dozens of different worlds and stations throughout Council space. They weren't just on Nexus Prime, they were everywhere, watching, learning, gathering intelligence while everyone dismissed them as harmless curiosities. How long? Keelin asked. How long have you been gathering this information? The answer came in the form of a timeline that stretched back over 50 standard cycles, coincidentally, exactly as long as the restricted species integration protocols had been in effect. The Kithra hadn't been discovered by the Council. They had discovered the Council and decided to investigate. They've been documenting everything, Juno breathed. Every classified meeting, every resource grab, every cover-up. You haven't just been studying galactic politics, you've been building a case. Nix made a sound that could only be described as satisfied, then created one more display. This one showed the current locations of every council member involved in the conspiracy, along with their security details, planned movements, and what appeared to be real-time monitoring of their communications. "The question," Keelin said slowly, "is what we do with all this information." That's when the alarm started. Not the gentle chimes that indicated a shift change or the melodic tones that announced mealtimes, but the harsh, urgent blaring that meant the station was either under attack or experiencing a critical system failure. Emergency lighting bathed the room in red, and the privacy shielding flickered as power was rerouted to essential systems. "Attention all personnel," Chancellor Vexani's voice echoed through the station's communication system, carrying harmonics that suggested she was either furious or preparing for war. "We are experiencing a security breach in multiple sectors. All non-essential personnel are to report to designated safe zones immediately." Fuzz looked up from the table, her paws still glowing with whatever connection she'd established with the station's systems. She chittered something that sounded distinctly smug. "What did you do?" Gornex demanded. The answer came in the form of holographic displays showing every screen and monitor throughout Nexus Prime. They were all broadcasting the same thing, the evidence the Cubs had gathered, laid out in careful detail for everyone to see. Council members taking bribes, resource extraction operations, the systematic classification and exploitation of primitive worlds, and the planned expansion of the program to include Earth and dozens of other worlds. "Oh my God," Juno said. "You just exposed the entire conspiracy to the whole station." Nix chittered something that definitely qualified as laughter, then created a display showing the panicked reactions of various council members throughout the facility. Some were trying to destroy evidence, others were attempting to flee, and at least 3 appeared to be having what could generously be called emotional breakdowns. "The security containment protocols have been activated," Thrask's voice said over the communications system, but now he sounded like someone trying to maintain authority, while his entire world collapsed around him. "All evidence of this alleged conspiracy is fabricated. Do not be deceived by primitive forgeries." But it was too late. The Cubs hadn't just released raw data. They'd organized it, cross-referenced it, and presented it in a format that was impossible to dismiss as coincidence or forgery. The sheer volume and consistency of the evidence painted a picture that even the most skeptical observer couldn't ignore. "This is going to change everything," Keelin said, and their voice carried the kind of awe reserved for watching empires fall in real time. Juno looked at the 3 Cubs, who were sitting calmly in the center of the chaos they'd unleashed, occasionally creating small holographic displays that showed the ongoing reactions throughout the station. "You planned this from the beginning," she realized. "The whole thing. Getting kicked out of the council session, being escorted away, bringing us here. You were waiting for the right moment to drop this bomb." Nix's response was a holographic display that showed Juno herself standing up in the council chamber, defending their right to observe. But the image was labeled with text that roughly translated to "catalyst." "You needed someone to give you the excuse," Juno said. "Someone to make enough noise that your revelation would look like a response to injustice rather than a planned attack." The Cubs chittered in harmony, a sound that somehow managed to convey both confirmation and gratitude. "Well then," Juno said, as the alarms continued to blare and the station descended into what could only be described as controlled chaos, "I guess we should probably figure out how to survive the revolution we just started." That's when the door exploded inward, and Security Chief Gornex discovered that being caught in the middle of a galactic conspiracy was about to become the least of his problems. The door didn't so much explode as disintegrate in a shower of sparks and twisted metal that suggested someone had brought military-grade breaching equipment to what was supposed to be a diplomatic discussion. Through the smoke, stepped Chancellor Vexani, flanked by what appeared to be the Council's emergency response team. Beings in powered armor who looked like they'd been recruited from the Intimidating Enforcers with Questionable Morals department. "The security breach ends now," Vexani announced, her skin cycling through colors that probably had names like impending violence and barely contained homicidal rage. "All evidence will be confiscated, all witnesses will be detained, and this unfortunate misunderstanding will be resolved quietly." That's when Nyx did something that made everyone in the room question their understanding of physics, technology, and the general laws governing how small, furry creatures should behave in crisis situations. He stood up and spoke. Not chittering, not holographic displays. Actual, perfectly clear galactic standard, delivered in a voice that carried the kind of authority that suggested he'd been conducting high-level negotiations since before most of the council members were born. "Chancellor Vexani," he said, his tone carrying the diplomatic equivalent of armor-piercing rounds, "I am Commander Nyx of the Kithra Intelligence Collective. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit genocide, resource theft, and violations of approximately 38 interstellar treaties." The silence that followed could have been harvested and sold as a renewable energy source. "Impossible," Vexani whispered. "The Kithra are primitive." Category 4. Classification. "We have the surveys." "You have the surveys we wanted you to have," Fuzz interrupted, her voice carrying the cheerful tone of someone revealing a particularly elegant prank. 50 cycles of carefully constructed evidence designed to support your preconceptions while we documented your crimes." Bounce grinned, an expression that looked deeply unsettling on his formerly cute features. "The Kithra Collective has been monitoring this sector for potential threats to developing civilizations. Congratulations, you qualified." The powered armor enforcers were raising their weapons when every screen in the station, including the ones built into their own equipment, suddenly displayed a message that made several of them stumble in surprise. "Galactic Enforcement, Authority Nexus. Prime is now under jurisdiction. Surrender all weapons and prepare for processing." "The Galactic Enforcement Authority," Keelin breathed. "They disbanded centuries ago." "They went dormant," Nyx corrected, "waiting for a civilization advanced enough to reactivate them and mature enough to wield their authority responsibly." Juno stared at the Cubs. No, at the Kithra operatives who had been playing the longest game in galactic history. "You've been building a case not just against the Council, but for humanity." "Your species shows remarkable potential," Nyx said, creating one final holographic display that showed human achievements across multiple fields: art, science, exploration, and, most importantly, the willingness to defend those who couldn't defend themselves. Today's actions merely confirmed our assessment. The station shuddered as massive ships decloaked around Nexus Prime, vessels that looked like they'd been designed by architects who understood that sometimes you needed to make a statement about the consequences of exploiting the innocent. Chancellor Vexani's skin had gone completely colorless. "This is impossible. The humans are primitive. The Kithra are pets." "The humans," Nyx said, with what could only be described as satisfaction, "are our new partners, and the Kithra Collective formally invites humanity to join the reformed Galactic Council, an organization dedicated to actual cooperation rather than exploitation." Juno felt like she was watching the entire political structure of known space rearrange itself in real time. "What happens to the old council?" "Trials," Bounce said cheerfully. "Lots and lots of trials." As Enforcement Authority officers began flooding into the station, Juno realized that her diplomatic career hadn't ended. It had just taken the most unexpected promotion in human history. She was no longer Earth's representative to a corrupt council. She was humanity's first ambassador to a galactic community that actually lived up to its ideals. Director Holt was going to need therapy. The Cubs, her partners, she corrected herself, were already creating new holographic displays, showing her the dozens of other species that had been waiting for someone to stand up to the Council's corruption. Civilizations that had been classified as primitive, despite achievements that rivaled anything in known space. "So," Juno said, watching as Security Chief Gornex was led away in restraints that looked suspiciously like they'd been designed specifically for brutarians, "what do we do for an encore?" Nix's grin was absolutely terrifying. "Oh, we're just getting started." Outside the shattered conference room, the old galactic order was ending, and thanks to 3 primitive cubs who had followed a disruptive human out of a council chamber, something much better was about to begin.